Ma'am, can you hear me?" She didn't answer, because she was still counting. 30 hours earlier, an RPG had torn their helicopter out of the sky. Fire along the tail section. Men screaming in the wreckage. 52 Navy SEALs pinned on a mountainside with no extraction, no reinforcements, and no radio, because someone inside their own chain of command had sold them out before they ever left the tarmac. Now the rescue team found her first, not the wounded, her. Blood dried dark across her forearms, both hands locked around a rifle that wasn't hers. 52, she said, voice cracked dry as the dust. "Tell me it's 52. "Yes, ma'am, all alive." And the young medic kneeling beside her went cold, because her eyes weren't the eyes of someone in shock. They were sharp, calculating. She was still triaging. Nobody knew yet who her father had been.
The medevac helicopter cut through the dark like a blade. Below it, the valley burned, orange light flickering against black rock, smoke curling upward in thin dying ribbons that caught the moonlight and scattered it into something almost beautiful, if beauty was a thing that still existed in a place like this. 52 men lay scattered across that hillside 12 hours ago, bleeding, broken. Some already gone before the sun came up. Now they were alive, all 52. The rescue team found her first, not the wounded, her. She was sitting with her back against a boulder, knees pulled to her chest, both hands wrapped around a rifle that wasn't hers. Blood dried dark and cracked across her forearms, her uniform torn at the shoulder. Her hair, once tied back neat and regulation, now hanging loose and matted with dust. She didn't look up when they approached. She didn't need to. "Ma'am," a young medic knelt beside her, voice careful, uncertain. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Silence. Because she was still counting, still running the numbers in her head like a prayer she couldn't stop reciting. 52. 52 breathing, 52 hearts still beating, which meant she could stop now. Except she couldn't. Her hands wouldn't unclench from the rifle. "Ma'am, I need you to look at me." The medic's fingers hovered near her wrist, checking for a pulse, finding one, strong, steady. Impossibly steady for someone who'd been awake for 30 hours straight. She finally lifted her head, and the medic froze. Because her eyes went the eyes of someone in shock. They weren't glassy or lost or drifting the way trauma usually left people. They were sharp, calculating. Like she was still triaging the scene around her, still counting exits, still measuring distance out of pure reflex, the way some people can't stop doing math in their heads even after the test is over. 52, she said, her voice cracked dry as the dust around her. "Tell me it's 52. The medic swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am. 52 accounted for, all alive." Something in her chest seemed to release. A breath held for hours finally let go. And then, for the first time since they found her, Hospital Corpsman Second Class Marlowe Sutton allowed herself to close her eyes. Just for a second. Just long enough to remember how she got here. 6 days earlier, 3,000 miles away, the world had been quiet. Too quiet, maybe. The kind of quiet that made her wake up at 0400 out of habit, even when there was nowhere to be. The kind of quiet where she'd lie in her rack at Naval Station Norfolk and listen to the pipes clank in the walls and think about her father, Master Chief Elias Sutton. 10 years gone, and still, somehow, everywhere. She kept his old sea bag under her bunk, never opened it much, didn't need to, she knew what was inside. A folded flag, a collection of medals she'd never once seen him wear, and a leather journal, cracked and soft with age, filled with handwriting she'd read so many times she could recite whole pages from memory. "Survival isn't about strength," one line read. "It's about who refuses to stop breathing." She used to think that was just something fathers said to daughters, a nice sentence, motivational, framed on the wall kind of wisdom. Until the day she understood he meant it literally. Because Elias Sutton hadn't just been a father who told stories about the Navy. He'd trained her for years, quietly, in the woods behind their house in Maine. On weekends, when other 12-year-old girls were at soccer practice or sleepovers, Marlowe was learning how to pack a wound with nothing but a shirt sleeve and pressure. How to read a person's pulse just by watching the color drain from their lips. how to move through brush without snapping a single twig. She never asked why. She just knew somewhere deep in her 12-year-old bones that this mattered, that this was love dressed up in drills and discipline, that this was the only language her father knew how to speak fluently. Some fathers taught their daughters to bake, some taught them to drive stick shift in an empty parking lot. Hers taught her how to find a pulse point through a winter coat in under 3 seconds. She used to resent it a little. There had been a particular Saturday she remembered, rain coming down sideways through the pines when she'd screamed at him that she just wanted to watch cartoons like a normal kid. He hadn't raised his voice back. He'd only crouched down to her height, water dripping off the brim of his cap, and said quietly that normal was a luxury he didn't trust the world to keep handing out. She hadn't understood that either, not then. Until the resentment quietly turned into something else. A kind of fierce private pride that she never let show on her face, not even when he wasn't looking. And then he was gone. A training accident, the Navy said. Classified specifics. A folded flag and a closed casket and a chaplain's hand on her mother's shoulder while the honor guard folded that triangle of stars with hands that trembled just slightly, just enough for a 15-year-old to notice. Marlowe didn't cry at the funeral. She just remembered standing there watching that flag get folded into something small enough to fit in her mother's lap and thinking, I will finish what you started. She didn't know yet what that meant. She just knew it was a promise, and promises made at gravesides had a way of outliving everything else. So she kept in. She enlisted the day she turned 18, went through corpsman training, graduated top of her class, though she never told anyone why she pushed so hard, why she stayed up memorizing anatomy charts until her eyes blurred, why she ran extra miles even when nobody was watching. Somebody had to carry it forward. Because if she stopped, it would mean he really was gone. Not just his body, all of him, every lesson, every late-night explanation about tourniquets and triage and the exact pressure point on a forearm where you could stop a bleed with 2 fingers and enough patience to hold still while someone screamed. She wasn't ready to lose that, too. So she didn't stop. She just kept moving forward. One deployment, one transfer. One quiet, competent, forgettable Tuesday after another, building a career that looked from the outside like nothing more than diligence. Her mother worried about her, in the quiet way mothers do when they've already lost one person to the uniform and can't bring themselves to say so out loud. Every phone call ended the same way. Be careful. Come home. I mean it, Marlowe. Marlowe always promised. She meant it every time, and every time some small, unspoken part of her wondered if a promise like that was hers to make. Nobody at Norfolk knew what was underneath her diligence. Nobody asked. Until the letter came. The knock on her barracks door came at 0600, which was already strange because nobody at Norfolk knocked before 0800 unless something was wrong. She opened it to find a chief she didn't recognize holding a manila folder against his chest like it was something fragile. Sutton? He asked. That's me. You've been requested for special assignment. He held out the folder. Task Unit Ashwood, reporting Monday. She blinked. Requested? She repeated. By who? The chief shrugged, which meant either he didn't know or he wasn't allowed to say. She took the folder anyway. Inside, a single page, standard transfer orders, vague mission parameters, nothing unusual, except for one line at the bottom, handwritten, not typed. Tell her Grady sent for her. Marlowe stared at that name for a long time. Grady. She hadn't heard it spoken aloud in 10 years. Not since the funeral, when a tall man in dress blues had knelt in front of her, eyes red-rimmed, and said the only thing he seemed able to say. I'm sorry. I should have gotten to him faster. She'd been 15, too young to understand what that meant, too young to ask the questions that mattered. She remembered mostly the smell of his uniform wool and rain and the way her mother had gripped her hand so hard it left marks. She remembered, too, the way he'd come by the house exactly twice after that. Once with a casserole dish he clearly hadn't cooked himself, standing awkward in the doorway like the threshold itself might judge him. Once, months later, with nothing at all, just to sit on the porch steps in silence with her mother for 20 minutes before driving away. After that, nothing. No calls. No cards at Christmas. As if guilt had a shelf life he'd simply let expire. Now she was 25. And Grady Voss apparently was still trying to say the same thing in the only way men like him knew how. Not with words, with orders, with opportunity dressed up as bureaucracy. She sat on the edge of her rack for a long time, folder open on her knees, and let herself feel the full weight of it. 10 years of silence finally cracking at the corners. Then she started packing, because whatever this was, she wasn't going to find out by staying still. She called her mother that night, the phone pressed to her ear while she folded uniforms into her sea bag with hands that wouldn't quite stay steady. "Task Unit Ashwood," her mother repeated when Marlowe told her. A long pause on the line. "That name. Marlowe, is that? I don't know yet. Is Grady Voss involved in this?" Marlowe stopped folding. "How did you know that?" "Because your father used to say his name in his sleep sometimes. Before he died." Her mother's voice had gone thin, careful, the way it always did when the subject edged too close to that year. "I always wondered if one day he'd come looking for you." "Why would he?" "I don't know, sweetheart. But be careful, please." "I will." "You always say that." "I always mean it." Her mother was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet Marlowe had learned to read over years of long-distance phone calls. The quiet that meant she was weighing whether to say something further or let it pass unspoken the way she usually did. "Your father meant it too. Every time." Marlowe closed her eyes, phone pressed hard against her ear, the small apartment's silence on the other end somehow louder than anything she'd hear in the field over the coming days. "Mom, did you know about what Voss said about the leak?" A long pause, long enough that Marlowe knew the answer before it came. "I've always known there was more to it than what they told us," her mother said finally, voice careful, threadbare, in the way it only got when the subject was Elias. "I just never had proof, never had a name. Your father used to get these calls in the last few months, late at night. He'd take them out on the porch so I couldn't hear. I asked him once what they were about." A small, broken laugh. "He told me it was nothing. I believed him because I wanted to, because believing the alternative meant admitting I couldn't protect either one of you from it. You couldn't have known. I could have asked harder questions. I could have pushed." Her mother's voice caught, then steadied, the same quiet discipline Marlowe recognized in her own reflexes. "I've spent 10 years wondering if silence was its own kind of failure. Don't you dare inherit that same silence now that you finally have the chance not to." "I won't." "Then go find out what happened to him and come home and tell me, whatever it is. I'd rather know the worst of it than keep guessing for another 10 years. Marlowe didn't have an answer for that. She said goodnight, hung up, and finished packing in silence, the weight of an unfinished sentence sitting heavier in her chest than the sea bag ever could. Task Unit Ashwood operated out of a nondescript compound near the Virginia coastline. No sign out front, no indication of what happened behind those fences, except the low, constant hum of purpose that seemed to radiate off every building. Marlowe reported Monday morning at 0700 sharp, sea bag over one shoulder, orders in hand. The Marine at the gate barely glanced at her paperwork before waving her through, and that should have been her first warning. Because usually new personnel got scrutinized, questioned, made to feel like outsiders until they proved otherwise. She walked straight through, which meant somebody had already vouched for her. She found the briefing room easily enough, tucked into the second building past the motor pool. Metal folding chairs, a whiteboard still smudged with the ghost of yesterday's notes, and 6 men in tan fatigues who all turned to look at her the moment she stepped through the door. Nobody said anything, which in its own way said everything. She'd seen that look before. The quick once-over, the instant recalculation. Small, female, doesn't belong here. She'd learned a long time ago not to flinch under it. "You lost, ma'am?" A broad-shouldered operator near the front leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His name tape read Harris. "HM2 Sutton?" She set her bag down with more force than necessary. "Reporting is ordered." Harris's eyebrows lifted. "Reporting where, exactly?" "Here." A pause. Someone in the back laughed under his breath, because a female corpsman showing up to a SEAL task unit wasn't exactly common. Wasn't unheard of either, but common enough that it didn't turn heads, which meant this still turned heads. "Command didn't say anything about a new medic," Harris said, glancing toward the empty seat at the head of the table like the answer might materialize there. "Then Command will be updating you shortly," said a voice from the doorway. Every head in the room turned. Commander Grady Voss filled the frame like he'd been built specifically for doorways. Broad, gray at the temples now, though she remembered him younger, darker-haired, kneeling in front of a 15-year-old girl at a funeral with his voice breaking apart. He looked at her for a long moment, and something passed across his face that she couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe? Or guilt, or both, tangled together so tightly they'd become the same emotion. "Sutton," he said. Just her name, nothing else. "Sir." He nodded once, sharp, like he was steadying himself against a wind only he could feel. "Everyone," he said, turning to the room. "This is HM2 Marlowe Sutton. She'll be attached to this unit for the duration of the upcoming operation." Harris's shoulders squared, something guarded settling into his posture. "With respect, Commander, we already have a corpsman. Doc Reyes is being reassigned, effective this morning." That landed like a dropped weight. Nobody argued, nobody dared, because when Voss made a decision, that decision was final, and everybody in that room understood the difference between a suggestion and an order dressed up as one. Marlowe kept her face neutral, kept her spine straight, didn't let a single flicker of the question screaming inside her chest show on the surface. Why me? Why now? Why here? Voss caught her eye across the room just for a second, and in that second she understood something without a single word being spoken. This wasn't random. This was 10 years in the making. After the room emptied, Voss lingered by the door watching the last of his men filter out toward the motor pool. "Get settled," he told her. "Barracks 3. I'll find you tonight." "Sir, with respect, I'd rather not wait until tonight." Something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. "You really are his daughter." He glanced past her toward the window, toward the gray water beyond it. "Tonight, Sutton. I promise you, it'll be worth the wait." She didn't like waiting. She never had. But she'd learned over 10 years of quiet diligence that some things couldn't be rushed without breaking, and she suspected this was one of them. The training compound stretched along a strip of coastline, where the wind never seemed to stop. Salt air, gray water, the kind of cold that got into your bones and stayed there even after you came inside, curling up behind your ribs like it planned to move in permanently. Marlowe spent her first 3 days proving herself in the smallest, most exhausting way as possible. Nobody questioned her paperwork out loud, but they tested her anyway. In the field, during drills, watching to see if she'd flinch during the mass casualty simulation, if she'd hesitate when the fake blood started spraying, if she'd freeze the way some rookies did when the pressure got turned all the way up. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. Because none of this was new to her. Because she'd been doing versions of this drill since she was 12 years old, in the woods behind a house in Maine, with a father who never once let her get comfortable. There had been a summer she remembered when he'd made her practice the same tourniquet application 40 times in a row. 40 times on a rubber training limb until her fingers moved faster than her thoughts could keep up with. She'd complained, loudly. He hadn't budged. "Someday your hands will need to know this before your brain catches up," he'd told her. "That's the only kind of ready that matters." She hadn't understood it then. She understood it now, every single time her hands moved before her fear could. By the end of the 3rd day, Harris had stopped glancing at her like she was a mistake somebody made in a filing office. By the end of the 4th day, he was asking her questions during breaks. "Where'd you train?" he asked, wiping sweat from his forehead as they sat on overturned crates near the range. "Naval Medical Center. Standard corpsman school. That's not what I asked. She glanced at him. You move like someone who's done this before, Harris said. Not the training, the real thing. Marlowe didn't answer right away, because how do you explain a childhood built entirely around preparation for a war nobody told you was coming? My father was a corpsman, she finally said. He taught me a few things. Harris studied her for a long moment. A few things? Enough things. He didn't push further, but something in his expression shifted, recalculated, the way people's faces do when they realize they've been underestimating something the whole time. Later that same afternoon, during a lull in the training schedule, Harris found her again near the range cleaning her issued rifle with the same methodical patience she brought to everything else. For what it's worth, he said, settling onto the crate beside her, I was wrong about you that first day. You weren't wrong. You were cautious. There's a difference. Maybe. He watched her hands move over the weapon, disassembling and reassembling components with an ease that still 4 days in caught him off guard. Most people who show up somewhere new, trying that hard to prove themselves, end up overcompensating, trying too hard to look tough. You didn't do that. I wasn't trying to look like anything. I know. That's what convinced me. He shook his head slightly, something like respect settling into his expression. You just did the work. Let the work speak. My old drill instructor used to say that's the only kind of confidence worth trusting. The kind that doesn't need an audience. Marlowe finished reassembling the rifle, set it down carefully across her knees. Your drill instructor sounds like he'd have gotten along with my father. Everybody's father in this line of work sounds like they'd have gotten along with everybody else's, Harris said, a faint, tired smile touching his mouth. Guess that's what happens when the job only leaves room for a handful of lessons that actually matter. By the end of the week, the whispers around the compound had changed shape entirely. Less about whether she belonged, more about where exactly she'd learned to belong so completely. She met the rest of the team in fragments over those first days, the way you meet people when the job is the only thing anyone has time for. Doyle, quiet and watchful, who kept his late mother's photograph tucked inside his helmet and never explained why, and never needed to. Castillo, barely 23, still soft around the edges in a way the older men had long since worn off, who called his grandmother every Sunday without fail. A dozen others whose names she learned the way she'd learned everything else that mattered in her life, by paying close, careful attention, because someday the paying attention might be the only thing standing between one of them and a body bag. She didn't know yet how soon someday would arrive. On the 6th morning, though, she didn't know yet it would be her last full day before the world tilted sideways. She found herself running the compound's perimeter trail before dawn, the same habit she'd kept since boot camp. 3 miles of cracked asphalt and salt-stung grass, looping along the fence line, while the sky slowly bruised itself from black to gray. Doyle fell into step beside her on the 2nd mile, saying nothing for a long stretch, the two of them breathing in matched rhythm against the cold. You run like you're chasing something, he finally said. Everyone runs like they're chasing something. Not like this. He glanced sideways at her, not unkindly. I've seen a lot of people run from fear. This isn't that. Marlowe kept her eyes forward, her pace steady. Then what is it? Looks more like you're trying to catch up to somebody. Doyle let that sit for a moment, the only sound between them the rhythmic slap of boots against pavement. My mother used to run that way too. Every morning for years after my father passed. I asked her once who she thought she was going to catch. He exhaled a small cloud of breath dissolving into the gray morning. She said she wasn't running toward anybody. She was running so she wouldn't have to sit still long enough to miss him. Marlowe didn't answer right away. The fence line blurred past gulls beginning to stir and cry somewhere over the gray water. Maybe it's both, she finally said, some days. Doyle nodded like that was answer enough, and they finished the last mile in the kind of comfortable silence that only exists between people who've decided, without ever saying so out loud, that they trust each other. Later that afternoon, Marlowe found herself in the compound's small chapel, an unremarkable room with folding chairs and a plain wooden cross, empty except for her. She hadn't planned to go in. Her feet had simply carried her there between briefings the way old habits sometimes do. She sat in the back row for a long time, her father's journal resting closed on her knee, and thought about her mother's voice on the phone the night before deployment orders came through. "Be careful. Come home, I mean it." She thought about the promise she'd made at her father's graveside at 15 before she'd understood what carrying it forward would actually cost. She thought about Voss standing in his office with 10 years of guilt folded into the lines of his face, finally setting down a weight he should never have had to carry alone. And she thought for the first time since arriving at Ashwood about what it might mean to actually find the truth. Not the abstract idea of it, the thing she'd chased in theory for a decade, the real thing. Names, faces, a reason. She wondered whether knowing would feel like relief or like a second funeral, and found she couldn't decide, and found that the not knowing which one it would be frightened her more than the mission itself. She didn't pray, exactly. She'd never been much for it, and her father hadn't been either, not in any conventional sense. But she sat there a while longer anyway, in the quiet, the way he used to sit at the edge of the lake in October, and let the silence do whatever it needed to do. When she finally stood to leave, she felt steadier than she had in days, not fearless, just ready in the only way her father had ever taught her readiness could exist. Voss called her into his office on the 5th night. The room was small, Spartan, a single lamp throwing long shadows across a desk covered in files she wasn't cleared to read. He didn't sit. He just stood by the window looking out at the dark water, his back to her for a long moment before he finally spoke. "You have his eyes," Voss said. Marlowe's chest tightened. "Sir?" "Your father." He turned. "You have his eyes. I didn't expect that. I don't know why I didn't." She said nothing, because what was there to say to that? "I should have told you the truth a long time ago," Voss continued, "about what happened to him. The Navy said it was a training accident. The Navy said a lot of things." Something hardened in his voice. None of them were true. The room seemed to shrink around her. "Then tell me now," Marlowe said. Quiet, steady, the same steadiness she used on wounded men, except this time aimed inward, holding herself together by sheer will. Voss exhaled slowly. Like the truth had weight, and he was finally setting it down after 10 years of carrying it alone. "Your father died on a classified operation, one that got compromised from the inside." He met her eyes. "There was a leak. Someone fed information to the wrong people. Your father's team walked into an ambush that should never have happened." Marlowe's hands curled into fists at her sides. "Who?" she said. Not a question, a demand. "We never found out for certain." Voss's voice dropped lower. "The investigation got buried. Files sealed, careers threatened if anyone kept digging. I kept digging anyway, quietly. For years, and you just let it go public with me now." "I never let it go at all." Something raw moved across his face. "I just didn't know how to bring you into something I couldn't finish. And now you can. Now I might have to." He hesitated, and in that hesitation Marlowe heard something else waiting underneath. "There's a name from back then, a man who worked the case alongside your father before everything fell apart. He disappeared off every roster in the Navy not long after. Some people say he went rogue. Some people say he was protected by whoever buried the case in the first place. I don't know which is true. But if we're right about what's happening now, we may need him before this is over." "Who is he?" "I'll tell you if it becomes necessary." Voss's expression tightened, some old caution rising to the surface. "Right now, I need you to hear the rest of what's coming." Marlowe filed the unanswered name away, quiet and sharp, the way she filed away everything that mattered. "Go on," she said. He slid a folder across the desk toward her. Marlowe stared at it like it might detonate. "What's this?" "Intelligence suggesting the operation that killed your father is connected to something happening right now. Something active. Something we're being sent to investigate in 6 days." Her pulse spiked. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that the same people who killed my father might still be operating? And you're sending me into the middle of it?"
"I'm telling you," Voss said, "that I requested you for this unit because I think you deserve the chance to find the truth. And because I think, God help me, you might be the only person equipped to survive what's waiting for us out there."
Silence stretched between them. Because what do you say to that? What do you say when the man responsible for not saving your father is now the one asking you to walk directly into the fire that killed him?
"You should have asked me," Marlowe finally said, "before you made this decision for me."
"You're right." Voss didn't look away. "I should have. I was afraid you'd say no."
"Would I have?"
"I don't know. Would you?" Marlowe looked down at the folder, at her father's case number stamped across the corner in faded ink, at 10 years of silence finally cracking open in front of her. She thought about the journal under her bunk, the handwriting she knew better than her own. Survival isn't about strength. It's about who refuses to stop breathing. "No," she said quietly. "I wouldn't have said no." Voss nodded slowly, like some invisible weight had shifted just slightly off his shoulders.
"Then I need you to hear the rest," he said, "because it gets worse before it gets better."
The rest of the briefing took 2 hours. 2 hours of maps and satellite images and coordinates for a valley Marlowe had never heard of, tucked into mountainous terrain along a border region flagged for instability. Intelligence suggested a compound operating under the cover of a private contracting group moving something valuable enough that 3 separate agencies had quietly flagged it without ever coordinating with each other.
Something valuable enough to kill for. Something that might be connected to the operation that took her father.
Voss walked her through the satellite imagery slide by slide, the compound's outbuildings, its patrol routes, the estimated force strength based on thermal scans from a past 3 days prior. He was thorough in the way of a man who'd rehearsed the briefing a dozen times in his head before ever giving it out loud. As if precision might somehow make up for 10 years of silence.
"Extraction point here." He tapped a ridge on the map. "If everything goes according to plan, we're in and out in 18 hours. And if it doesn't go according to plan, then we adapt."
He looked up at her. "That's the job." By the time Marlowe left Voss's office, the compound was dark and silent, the wind still cutting cold off the water, the stars scattered thin across a moonless sky. She didn't go back to her bunk right away. She walked instead, down toward the water, boots crunching against gravel, breath fogging in front of her, because her mind wouldn't stop. Because 10 years of grief had just been handed a shape, a location, a possibility. And somewhere in the middle of that possibility, an unnamed man who might hold the last missing piece. She sat on a low seawall, pulled her father's journal from her jacket pocket, the one she carried everywhere now, without quite admitting why, and flipped it open to a random page under the weak glow of a distant floodlight. The margin was covered in his tight, slanted handwriting. "The hardest part of this job isn't the wounds you can see, it's carrying the ones you can't. You learn to keep moving anyway, because someone always needs you standing." She read it twice, then closed the journal and pressed it flat against her chest like she could push the words directly into her heart through sheer will. "I'm coming," she whispered to the dark water. "Whoever did this to you, I'm coming." The wind answered with nothing but silence, which felt somehow like a promise being witnessed. 6 days passed in a blur of preparation. Weapons checks, medical kit inventories triple-checked and triple-checked again. Team briefings where Marlowe learned names and faces and the small human details that made strangers into people worth protecting. Harris had a daughter back home who was learning to ride a bike, training wheels off for the first time last month, according to the photo he carried folded in his wallet. Doyle kept a photo of his late mother tucked inside his helmet, worn soft at the corners from years of handling. Castillo, barely 23, still called his grandmother every Sunday, without fail, apologizing in advance if deployment ever made him miss the call. 52 men total split across the operation. 52 lives that would soon depend on decisions made in seconds under fire, with no room for hesitation. Marlowe studied every medical file, Memorized every allergy, every prior injury, every detail that might matter when it mattered most. Because that was the job. Her father had taught her that lesson before the Navy ever put a rank on her collar. You don't wait until the crisis to learn the person. You learn them first, so that when the crisis comes, you're not fighting to save a stranger. You're fighting to save someone you already know. She spent an evening talking with Reyes, the outgoing corpsman, absorbing every piece of institutional knowledge he was willing to hand over before his reassignment took him elsewhere. He watched her work through a mock trauma scenario with an efficiency that made his eyebrows climb. "You're going to be fine out there," he told her on his way out the door. "More than fine, probably. Just don't let them make you carry more than your share." "I won't," she said. She didn't know yet how big a lie that would turn out to be. That night, lying in her rack with the compound gone quiet around her, Marlowe let herself drift back to a memory she hadn't visited in years. Not because it was painful, because it was so ordinary it usually slipped past her, buried under the louder, harder memories of the funeral and the folded flag and the 10 years that followed. She'd been 13. Late autumn, the woods behind their house gone the color of rust, and old pennies the air sharp enough to sting when you breathed too deep. Her father had led her a mile off the trail to a small clearing she'd never seen before, carrying nothing but a first aid kit and a stopwatch. "Today, we're not doing tourniquets," he'd told her, setting the kit down on a fallen log. "Thank God." "Don't thank him yet." A ghost of a smile, the closest he ever got to actual humor. "Today, we're doing something harder." Harder than tourniquets? "Today, we're doing patience." She hadn't understood. He'd made her sit in that clearing for 2 hours, in the cold, without moving, without speaking, just watching the woods around them shift and settle and come alive with small sounds she'd never noticed before. A woodpecker 3 trees over, a rustle in the underbrush that turned out to be nothing more than a squirrel burying something for winter. The particular quality of light through bare branches at 4 in the afternoon, gold and thin and fading fast. "This is the part nobody teaches you," he'd said finally as the light started to go. "Everybody wants to teach you how to move fast. Nobody teaches you how to be still. But stillness is what keeps you alive long enough to need the fast part at all." "That doesn't make sense." "It will." He'd helped her to her feet, her legs stiff and half asleep beneath her. "One day you're going to be somewhere loud and terrifying, and every instinct in your body is going to tell you to move, to fix, to fight. And for 1/2 of 1 second, you're going to need to be still instead. Just long enough to see clearly what's actually in front of you." He'd looked at her then, serious in a way that used to scare her a little, back before she understood it was just love wearing its work clothes. "That 1/2 second is going to save someone's life, maybe yours. I need you to trust me on that, even if you don't understand it yet." She hadn't understood it, not at 13. She understood it now, lying in a bunk 3,000 miles from that clearing, 10 years and 1 deployment order away from finding out exactly how right he'd been. There was a moment 2 days before deployment when Harris found her alone in the equipment room, methodically repacking her kit for the 3rd time that afternoon. "You don't have to prove anything else," he said. "Not to us. Not anymore." "I'm not doing it for you." "Then who?" Marlowe didn't answer right away, her hands still moving through the familiar ritual of checking and rechecking. The same ritual her father used to run through before every hunting trip, every long weekend in the woods that was never really about hunting at all. "Someone who isn't here to see it," she finally said. Harris didn't push. He just nodded the way men who'd buried their own ghosts tended to nod at other people's, and left her to finish in peace. The night before deployment, Voss found her on the tarmac, going through her kit one final time by flashlight. "You ready?" he asked. "No," Marlowe said honestly, "but I'm going anyway." Something almost like a smile crossed his face. Tired, worn, but real. "Your father used to say something similar," he said, "right before every op, word for word almost." Marlowe's hands stilled over her kit. "What did he say?" Voss looked out at the aircraft waiting on the runway, engines already beginning their low building hum.
He said readiness was a myth. Voss said quietly. Said nobody's ever ready. You just decide the mission matters more than the fear, and then you go anyway.
Marlowe closed her eyes for a moment, because that sounded exactly like him, exactly like the man who taught a 12-year-old girl how to stop a bleed while pretending it was just another Saturday afternoon in the woods behind their house.
Then I guess I'm my father's daughter, she said.
Voss studied her for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something rawer, something closer to confession.
He'd be proud of you, he said. I need you to know that, whatever happens out there. He'd be proud.
Marlowe swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in her throat.
Don't, she said quietly. Don't say that like it's goodbye. It's not, Voss said. It's a promise that we're bringing everyone home, all 52.
She nodded once, sharply, forcing the emotion back down where she could control it.
All 52,
she repeated. There was a stretch of quiet between them, then filled only by the distant whine of engines warming and the low murmur of men checking gear one last time.
Voss didn't move to leave, and Marlowe didn't press him to. Can I tell you something, Voss finally said, that I've never told anyone? Not even the Navy in all the reports I filed? Go ahead. The night your father died, I was 300 yards away, pinned down, unable to reach him. His voice had gone flat, stripped of its usual command. I heard the radio call. Heard him give his position, calm as anything, like he was reading off a grocery list instead of telling us where to find his body afterward. I've replayed that call in my head more nights than I can count, wondering if I'd moved faster, if I'd pushed through instead of holding position like I was ordered to, whether it would have mattered. Would it have? I don't know. I'll never know. That's the part that doesn't go away. He looked at her, then something raw and unguarded in his expression. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that bringing you here wasn't just about giving you answers. It was about finally being honest with the one person who deserved honesty most, even 10 years too late. Marlowe absorbed that in silence, the confession settling into her chest alongside everything else the past week had handed her. Thank you, she said, for telling me now instead of never. Don't thank me yet, Voss said. Thank me if we bring everyone home. Because she didn't know yet how close that number would come to breaking. Because she didn't know yet that somewhere in that valley waited a name Voss still hadn't given her, a man tangled up in her father's death in ways none of them fully understood yet. Because she didn't know yet that within 72 hours, she would be the only thing standing between 52 men and a mountainside that nearly swallowed them whole. She only knew this. She was ready to find out. Around her, the rest of the team began boarding the easy, practiced rhythm of men who'd done this 100 times before, checking gear, checking each other, the particular camaraderie that exists only among people who've agreed silently and permanently to carry each other's weight when it matters. Castillo caught her eye as he passed, offering a nervous, boyish grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Harris clapped a hand briefly on her shoulder, said nothing and kept walking, which somehow said more than words would have. Doyle nodded once, the same quiet acknowledgement he'd offered on their morning run, and disappeared up the ramp ahead of her. Voss lingered a moment longer, watching her the way a man watches a door he isn't sure he should be opening. Your father would have been proud of the corpsman you turned into, he said quietly, even before any of this. I just want you to know that, whatever else happens tonight. You keep saying that like you're not sure I'll hear it again. I'm sure, Voss said. I just don't like leaving anything unsaid anymore. Learned that the hard way once, a long time ago. The aircraft engines roared to life behind her, cutting through the cold night air, and Marlowe Sutton picked up her kit, squared her shoulders, and walked toward whatever was waiting for her in the dark. Because somewhere out there, 10 years of silence was finally about to speak, and she intended to be listening when it did. The valley looked peaceful from 3,000 feet, which should have been the first warning.
because nothing about this mission had been peaceful. Not the 6 days of preparation, not the 2-hour briefing that cracked open 10 years of buried grief, not the unfinished name Voss still hadn't given her, sitting between them like a door he wasn't ready to open. Not the look on his face when he promised her all 52 would come home. Peaceful was a lie the landscape was telling them, and they were about to fly straight into it. Marlowe sat strapped into the helicopter's jump seat medical kit secured across her lap, watching the terrain unfold beneath them through the open door. Jagged ridgelines, dry riverbeds cutting through rust-colored earth, a cluster of buildings in the distance that intelligence had flagged as the contractor compound. Harris sat across from her, weapon resting between his knees, eyes closed like he was praying or sleeping or both. Castillo kept checking his watch. 23 years old and already fidgeting like a man twice his age who'd done this too many times. Doyle just stared out at the horizon, quiet, the way he always got before things got loud. Marlowe's hand drifted to her jacket pocket, to the shape of her father's journal, worn soft at the edges, pressed flat against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Somewhere down there was the truth about what happened to him. Somewhere down there was also the very real possibility that she wouldn't survive long enough to find it. The pilot's voice crackled through the headset. 2 minutes to LZ. Voss, sitting up front, turned back toward the cabin, met Marlowe's eyes across the noise and the vibration and the growing tightness in everyone's chest. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His expression said it for him. Stay sharp, stay alive. Bring everyone home. She nodded once. And that's when the first rocket hit. The explosion came from below and to the right, a streak of white fire punching up through the dark, and the helicopter lurched sideways so violently that Marlowe's shoulder slammed into the bulkhead. "RPG!" someone shouted. "Taking fire! Taking fire!" The world became noise, metal screaming against metal, the pilot fighting the controls, voice climbing into something raw and desperate. Harris already moving, already reaching for the door, gun muscle memory taking over where thought couldn't keep up. Marlowe's training kicked in before her fear could, because that's what her father built into her all those years ago in the Maine woods. Not fearlessness, just faster reflexes than the panic. "Brace!" Voss's voice sharp through the headset. "Brace for impact!" She grabbed the strap above her head with one hand, Kit clutched to her chest with the other, and watched through the open door as the ground came up too fast, too crooked, the horizon spinning where it should have stayed still. The impact threw her forward. Everything went white. Then dark. Then the smell of smoke and fuel and blood all tangled together into something her body recognized before her mind caught up to it. She woke to screaming. Not her own. Someone else's. High and panicked and close. Marlowe blinked against the smoke, against the ringing in her ears that made everything sound like it was happening underwater, and forced her eyes to focus. The helicopter lay on its side, half crumpled against a rock outcropping, one rotor blade snapped off and buried in the dirt 20 yards away, like a dropped spear. Fire licked along the tail section. 90 seconds, maybe less, before things got a lot worse. "Move!" Her own voice, hoarse, barely recognizable. "Everyone, move, now!" She unclipped her harness, fell more than climbed out of her seat. Every instinct screaming at her to run, to get clear, to survive, except survival wasn't the job. The job was making sure everyone else survived too. She found Castillo first, pinned against a twisted section of fuselage, blood streaming down the side of his face, eyes wide with the particular panic of someone who'd never actually been shot at before. "Doc!" His voice cracked. "Doc, my leg!" "I've got you." Already moving, already assessing, hands finding the break in his femur through the fabric of his pants with practiced efficiency. Compound fracture. Not arterial, survivable if she moved fast enough. "Stay with me, Castillo. Look at me, not the leg." "It hurts, I know." Already splinting, already working hands, steady, even as gunfire started cracking somewhere beyond the ridge. "It's supposed to hurt. Means you're still alive to feel it." Which was the exact thing her father used to tell wounded men decades ago. She hadn't meant to say it. It had just come out. Automatic. Inherited. A phrase passed down like a family recipe, except instead of bread, it made grown men breathe slower in the worst moment of their lives. Castillo's breathing steadied slightly, just enough, and she moved on, because there wasn't time to sit with what had just happened, wasn't time to wonder how much of her father was still living inside her own reflexes. Harris appeared through the smoke, dragging Doyle by the collar of his vest, both of them limping, both of them alive. "Two more inside," Harris shouted over the growing chaos. "Pinned under the frame." "Get them out. I'll hold the perimeter." "You'll hold the—" Harris stared at her like she'd suggested something insane. "Sutton, you're a corpsman, not— I'm the one with a working rifle and both hands free." Already moving toward the wreckage, already scanning the ridgeline where muzzle flashes were beginning to bloom in the dark like small, deadly fireflies. "Go, now." Harris hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then he went. Something in her voice left no room for argument, something that sounded less like a request and more like an order given by someone who'd been giving them her whole life without ever holding the rank to match. The next 20 minutes blurred into fragments. Gunfire from the ridge, return fire from what was left of the team, Marlowe dragging wounded men behind whatever cover she could find, packing wounds with a focus that left no room for anything else, not fear, not doubt, not the tremor that lived somewhere underneath her calm and never once made it to the surface. Voss found her crouched behind a boulder working on a SEAL named Reyes, whose shoulder had taken shrapnel from the crash. "Casualty count," Voss demanded, breathless, blood on his own forehead from a cut he hadn't noticed yet. 2 critical, 6 wounded but mobile. A pause, doing the math, hating the math. Everyone else is accounted for. Alive. For now. For now, she agreed. That's all any of them had, a series of nows stacked precariously on top of each other, threatening to collapse with every incoming round. "We need to consolidate," Voss said. "There's a cave system about 200 meters up the slope. Better cover. Defensible position." 200 meters? Through open ground? Under fire? "You have a better plan?" Marlowe looked around at the wreckage, at the wounded, at the growing muzzle flashes multiplying along the ridge like the enemy was calling in reinforcements they hadn't planned for. "No," she admitted, "but I have a faster one." Getting everyone up that slope took 45 minutes that felt like 6 hours. Marlowe moved between the wounded like something possessed, splinting, packing wounds, applying pressure, with a calm efficiency that made even the most battle-hardened SEALs start looking at her differently, because somewhere in the chaos the whispers started. She caught fragments of it between explosions. Where'd she learn that? Did you see the way she— That's not corpsman training, man, that's something else. She didn't have time to explain. She barely had time to breathe. Twice during that climb, she found herself dragging a wounded man by the drag handle of his vest while returning fire with her free hand. Some part of her brain that should have been screaming in terror, instead running cold, clean calculations. Angle of the ridge, distance to cover, whether the man beside her would survive the next 30 seconds if she didn't move faster. It didn't feel like courage. It felt like arithmetic. The same arithmetic her father had drilled into her 1,000 times over 1,000 quiet weekends, until the arithmetic became the only language her body knew how to speak under pressure. By the time they reached the cave system, cut into the rock like a wound in the mountainside, they'd lost radio contact with base entirely. No extraction, no reinforcements. 30-plus men, several critically wounded, cut off in hostile territory with an enemy force that seemed to know exactly where they were heading before they even got there. "That's not luck," Voss said, quietly staring out at the darkness beyond the cave mouth. "That's not bad luck. That's someone feeding them our position." Marlowe looked up from the wound she was packing. "Someone in comms? Someone with access to our flight plan." Voss's expression darkened, the dirt and blood on his face doing nothing to soften it. "Someone who knew our coordinates before we even left the tarmac." The cave went quiet around them. Everyone had heard him. Everyone was now doing the same silent math, running through faces, wondering which one of the people they trusted with their lives might have handed those same lives to the enemy. Marlowe found herself thinking unexpectedly of a conversation with her father when she was 16, not long after the funeral, when trust had become a word she turned over suspiciously in her mouth like a coin she wasn't sure was real. She'd asked her mother once how you were supposed to keep serving a system that could bury the truth about your own father's death without so much as a flinch. Her mother hadn't had a good answer. Nobody ever did. But sitting in that cave now, watching 30 men process the possibility that one of their own had sold them out, Marlowe understood something she hadn't at 16. The system wasn't the enemy. The system was just people, and people were capable of both kinds of loyalty at once. The kind that got you killed protecting someone, and the kind that got someone killed protecting yourself. Her father had chosen the first kind, all the way to the end. Whoever had leaked their coordinates had chosen the second. The difference between those two choices was the entire shape of the war she'd apparently been born into without ever signing up for it. "You're quiet," Harris observed, settling down near her with a canteen in hand. "Just thinking." About the leak? About how many versions of this exact betrayal must have happened before for my father to end up buried the way he did. She accepted the canteen he offered, took a small sip, handed it back. You spend enough time in this line of work, you start to wonder if loyalty's even the right word for what most people actually practice. Feels more like a habit that breaks the second it gets expensive enough. Harris considered that for a long moment. My old man used to say loyalty's easy when it's free. The real test is whether you keep it when it starts costing you something. Your father again. Everybody's father, apparently. A tired, wry smile. Guess that's the one lesson that doesn't need translating across generations. Marlowe almost laughed, the sound catching somewhere between exhaustion and genuine warmth, a small, unexpected gift in the middle of a night that had offered so few of them. Night fell hard and fast in the mountains. Marlowe worked by red lens flashlight, moving from wounded man to wounded man, exhaustion clawing at the edges of her focus without ever quite reaching the center of it, the way a tide claws at a shoreline without ever fully taking it. Castillo drifted in and out of consciousness, fever climbing slightly despite her best efforts. Reyes gritted his teeth through shrapnel removal without a single complaint, watching her work with something like awe. "You ever think about becoming an actual doctor?" he asked, voice tight with pain. "Because this is not normal corpsman stuff, Doc." "Focus on breathing, Reyes. I'm serious." His eyes tracked her hands. "Where'd you learn to do that thing with the pressure point?" "I didn't know that was even a thing you could do without—" "My father taught me." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Reyes blinked through the pain. "Your father, a doctor, corpsman, like me." "Where's he now?" Her hands went quiet for half a second, just half a second, long enough that Reyes noticed, even through his own pain. "He died," she said quietly. 10 years ago. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." Voice steady again, walls rebuilt in an instant, hands resuming their work like nothing had cracked open at all. "Just be quiet and let me finish this." Reyes fell silent, but his eyes stayed on her, thoughtful, like he was starting to understand something the rest of the team hadn't figured out yet. That whatever Marlowe Sutton was, she wasn't just a corpsman filling a gap in the roster. She was something built, deliberately, carefully, by someone who'd loved her enough to prepare her for exactly this kind of night, even if neither of them had known back then what kind of night it would turn out to be. It occurred to her in that brief, exhausted moment that this was perhaps the truest definition of inheritance she'd ever encountered. Not what someone left behind, but what they'd built into you, long before you understood you'd need it. He watched her for a while longer, working her way down the row of wounded men with the same unhurried focus, and found himself thinking about his own father, a long-haul truck driver who'd taught him nothing more dangerous than how to back a trailer into a tight space. It struck him somewhere in the exhausted haze of that long night that everyone carried some version of their parents forward into whatever they became, whether the lessons were about backing up trailers or packing gunshot wounds. The difference, he supposed, was simply what kind of night each lesson had been built for. "Doc," he said quietly before she moved on to the next patient, "for what it's worth, whatever he was preparing you for,
I'm glad he did.
Marlowe paused, something flickering briefly across her exhausted face. So am I, she said. Most days.
Just most days.
Tonight makes it easier to believe it was worth it. A ghost of something almost like a smile. Ask me again on a quieter night, and I might tell you a different story. Deal, Reyes said, unknowingly echoing the exact word that would pass between them again in a few hours on a canteen run near the cave mouth. The small promise repeating itself before either of them realized it had become a pattern, a quiet thread of ordinary humanity stitched through the worst night of both their lives. Voss found her an hour later, sitting near the cave entrance, cleaning blood off her hands, with water she couldn't spare, staring out at the darkness where the enemy was still moving, still circling, still waiting. You should rest, he said. So should you. I'm not the one holding this unit together. Marlowe glanced back at the wounded scattered through the cave, at Castillo's labored breathing, at Reyes, watching her with those thoughtful, calculating eyes. Neither am I, she said. Not really. I'm just doing what I was trained to do. By your father. By my father. Voss sat down beside her, wincing slightly at some injury he hadn't mentioned yet. I need to tell you the rest of it, he said. About why they knew where we'd be, and about the name I didn't give you before we left. Marlowe's stomach tightened. Tell me. I've suspected for months there was a leak somewhere in the operation planning chain. Someone with access to flight schedules, coordinates mission parameters. He paused. I didn't want to believe who it pointed to. Who? Voss hesitated, which was answer enough in its own terrible way. Lieutenant Commander Price, he finally said. Our liaison officer, the one who's supposed to be coordinating our extraction right now. Marlowe felt something cold settle into her chest. The same person controlling our comms. The same person, Voss confirmed, who conveniently lost contact with us the moment things went sideways. The silence between them stretched taut. And the other name? Marlowe pressed. The one you wouldn't give me at the compound? Voss exhaled long and slow, like a man finally deciding to set something down he'd been carrying too long. His name is Kessler, he said. He worked this same network alongside your father before it all fell apart. Vanished off every Navy roster not long after your father died. Some people say he went rogue. Some people say he was protected by whoever buried the case in the first place. I've spent years hearing rumors he's still out here somewhere working it from outside the system because the system stopped being safe to work it from inside. You think he's involved in what's happening now? I think if this valley is connected to whatever got your father killed, Kessler is the only person alive who might already know more than we do. Voss looked away, something uneasy crossing his face. I didn't tell you before we left because I wasn't sure I believed it myself. I'm less sure now that I don't. Marlowe absorbed that in silence, filing it away next to everything else the night had handed her. Did you ever suspect him before this? She asked. Price, I mean, before tonight. Voss was quiet for a moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on an answer he didn't like the taste of. There were signals, he admitted. Small things, reports filed a few hours later than they should have been, questions in briefings that felt more curious than procedural. I told myself I was being paranoid. Told myself 10 years of chasing your father's ghost had made me suspicious of everyone with access to a radio. He shook his head slowly. I should have trusted my own instincts. I've spent a decade telling myself I couldn't afford to be wrong about people again. Funny how that same caution ends up costing lives anyway, just in a different direction. You couldn't have known for certain. I could have asked harder questions. Same as your mother, probably wondering the same thing about your father's late-night calls. Something flickered across his face, some private grief Marlowe hadn't expected. You talked to her before we left, didn't you? How did you know that? Because you've got that same look she used to get, right after your father died. Like she was carrying a question so heavy it changed the way she stood. Voss exhaled, long and slow. I used to see her at the commissary sometimes in the years right after. Never knew what to say. Ended up saying nothing most of the time, which I've regretted since. She still remembers you, Marlowe said quietly. The casserole you brought that wasn't yours? The 20 minutes on the porch? Voss's throat worked. I didn't know what else to give her. Didn't have the answers she deserved. Figured silence was better than empty promises. She'd probably tell you silence never felt better, just quieter. Voss absorbed that without flinching, the way a man absorbs a truth he's already suspected about himself for a long time. Then I owe her an apology too, he said. Once this is over, if we're lucky enough to get an over. Because if Voss was right about Price, they weren't just trapped by geography. They were trapped by betrayal, layered over an older betrayal that had never stopped bleeding. And somewhere out there in the dark, the people hunting them already knew every move they were planning to make next. The attack came just before dawn. Marlowe heard it before she saw it. A shift in the wind. A change in the rhythm of insects that had gone quiet too suddenly. Her father's voice in her head, old instinct surfacing like it had never left. Silence is a warning. Learn to hear it. Contact! Someone shouted from the cave mouth, and then the world exploded into gunfire again. She moved without thinking, grabbed her kit, grabbed the rifle she'd claimed from a fallen operator hours earlier, positioned herself near the wounded, ready to defend the only thing that mattered now. There was no time to be scared. There was only time to act. The firefight lasted 11 minutes that felt like 11 years, muzzle flashes strobing against cave walls, shouted commands overlapping with screams, the acrid bite of gunpowder thick enough to taste. When it ended, 3 more men were wounded, none dead. Not yet. Marlowe moved between them with the same steady efficiency she'd shown all night, patching, packing, stabilizing, her focus, never once slipping loose from the task in front of her, even as her own hands had begun to ache from hours of continuous work, even as the small tremor she never let anyone see had started creeping in at the edges whenever she paused too long between patients. She didn't pause long. She'd learned a long time ago that pausing was a luxury reserved for after, not during, and during was the only tense that mattered right now. Harris found her afterward breathing hard, blood on his hands that wasn't his own. How many more waves like that can we take? He asked. Marlowe looked at her, dwindling supplies. At the wounded stacking up faster than she could stabilize them, at the growing certainty that they were running out of time in every possible direction. I don't know, she admitted, but we're going to find out. The lull that followed felt different from the first thinner somehow, stretched tight over an exhaustion that had settled into everyone's bones by now. Marlowe moved through the cave doing a final head count, checking faces against the mental roster she'd built over 6 days of studying files, matching names to the men now breathing, bleeding, surviving around her. Prentice, stable. Castillo fever holding but not worsening. Reyes, shoulder bandaged, tight, still watching her with those same thoughtful eyes. Doyle, quiet at his post near the cave mouth, rifle, never once wavering from the darkness beyond it. 31 men in the cave, 21 more holding the perimeter outside according to Voss's last count, dug into whatever cover the terrain offered, waiting out the same uncertain hours. 52, if the math held. She sat for a moment with her back against the cool stone, allowing herself 30 seconds of stillness before the next crisis demanded her attention, and thought about her father's clearing in the Maine woods. The 2 hours of forced patience he'd made her sit through at 13. This is the part nobody teaches you. Everybody wants to teach you how to move fast. Nobody teaches you how to be still. She understood now, sitting in a cave 3,000 miles from that clearing, why he'd insisted on it so fiercely. Because the fast part, the moving, the fixing, the fighting, that part came naturally once you'd trained for it long enough. It was the stillness that took discipline. The stillness that let you actually see what was happening instead of simply reacting to it. She closed her eyes for exactly 30 seconds, counted them silently, the way she'd counted the wounded, and then opened them again, steadier, ready for whatever came next. By mid-morning, the cave had settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that came not from safety but from exhaustion on both sides of the fight. Marlowe used the lull to reorganize her supplies. counting bandages, rationing what little morphine remained, trying to calculate how many more hours they could stretch what they had left. Castillo, propped against the rock wall, watched her work with feverish, half-lidded eyes. "Doc," his voice was thin, "tell me something, anything. I need to think about something that isn't this cave." Marlowe glanced at him, then at the bandage on his leg, then made a decision she didn't fully understand herself. "My father used to take me fishing," she said, voice quiet, hands still moving. "Every October. Same lake, same spot on the shore. He never talked much out there, just handed me a rod and let the silence do whatever it needed to do." "Sounds nice." It was. She paused, checking his pulse. "One year I asked him why we only ever fished the same spot. He said some places hold more than fish. Said you keep going back because the place remembers you, even when you don't remember why you needed it." Castillo's eyes had drifted half-closed, breathing evening out slightly. "You think he'd be proud," he mumbled, "seeing you out here." Marlowe's hands stilled just for a moment on the edge of his bandage. "I hope so," she said. "I've spent 10 years hoping so." She didn't say the rest of it, didn't say that hope after 10 years had started to feel less like comfort and more like a wound that never quite closed. She kept that part folded away the way she kept the journal folded away, close enough to reach but not close enough to break her. Doyle, sitting a few feet away with a bandage of his own wrapped tight around one forearm, spoke up quietly without opening his eyes. "My mother used to say something like that. About places, remembering people." He shifted slightly against the rock. "She used to visit my father's grave every Sunday, rain or shine, for years. I asked her once why she kept going when it never seemed to make her feel any better. She said feeling better wasn't the point. Showing up was the point." A faint, tired smile. "Guess your father and my mother would have gotten along." "Guess they would have," Marlowe said softly, and for a moment, in the middle of a cave surrounded by wounded men and dwindling supplies, something almost like warmth passed quietly between the three of them, small and stubborn against the weight of everything else pressing down on that mountain. At noon, Reyes caught her alone near the cave mouth, refilling canteens from what remained of their water supply. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're going to anyway." A faint, exhausted smile. "Fair." He hesitated, then pushed forward. "Last night, when you told me your father died, you looked like you were about to say more. And then you didn't." Marlowe didn't answer right away. "There's a lot more," she finally said. "More than I understood myself until about a week ago." "You want to talk about it?" "Not yet." She capped the canteen, met his eyes steadily. "Ask me again if we make it out of here." "That a promise?" "It's a deal." A ghost of something almost like humor crossed her face, brief and worn thin by exhaustion. "You survive, I talk. Everybody wins." Reyes huffed out something close to a laugh, the first one either of them had managed since the crash. "Deal," he said. It was a small moment, barely anything in the scope of everything happening around them, but it steadied something in her chest anyway. A reminder that underneath all the blood and fear there were still people worth fighting to bring home, worth laughing with for 3 seconds in the middle of a nightmare. Sometime after noon, one of the newer men, a young operator named Prentice, who'd taken a graze along his ribs during the crash, asked Marlowe to check the wound again, worry plain on his face despite his effort to hide it. "It's not bleeding through," she told him, peeling back the bandage carefully, checking the wound site with practiced eyes. "Clean. No sign of infection yet. You got lucky." "Doesn't feel lucky. Compared to the alternative, it is." She began rewrapping it, her movements economical, unhurried, despite everything happening around them. "First deployment? Second. First one where anybody shot at me directly." He attempted a laugh that came out thin and unconvincing. "Guess I pictured it different." "In my head, I mean, before it actually happened." "Everybody does." Marlowe tied off the bandage, checked his pulse out of habit more than necessity. My father used to say the gap between imagining a thing and living through it is where most people break. The ones who make it through are the ones who figure out how to close that gap before it happens. Rehearse it enough times in your head that when the real thing comes, some part of you already recognizes it. Did it work? For you, I mean. Marlowe considered the question, honestly, turning it over before answering. I don't know yet, she admitted. This is the first time I've actually needed to find out. Prentice studied her for a moment, something like relief passing over his young face, the particular relief of a scared person realizing the person taking care of them is scared too, just better at carrying it. You're doing good, Doc, he said quietly. Whatever your gap looked like, seems like it closed just fine. She didn't have a response for that. She only nodded, checked his pulse one final time, and moved on to the next wounded man, carrying his small kindness with her, the way she carried everything else that mattered. An hour later, Voss called a brief huddle near the cave's rear chamber, gathering the handful of men still steady enough to plan. Marlowe joined at the edge of the circle, listening more than speaking, watching the map spread across a flat stone between them. If Kessler's answer holds, Voss said, tracing a finger along the ridge, and if whoever's coming up that road is actually friendly, we consolidate here and wait for confirmation before we move anyone. If it's hostile, he paused, jaw tight, we're already in the best defensible position we're going to get. Cave mouth is a choke point. We hold it as long as we need to. And if the wounded can't hold that long? Marlowe asked. Then you and I figure out a fallback together when we get there, not before. Voss met her eyes, something steady and certain in his expression, despite the exhaustion carved into every line of his face. I'm not making another decision that affects your life without you in the room this time. I already made that mistake once. Marlowe held his gaze a moment longer than necessary, something unspoken passing between them. An old debt, slowly, quietly being repaid, one decision at a time. Understood, she said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she believed him. 10 years of silence had a way of teaching a person not to trust promises made under pressure, but something in the way Voss said it, plain and unadorned, without the practiced smoothness of a man managing her feelings, made this one land differently than the others had. The second wave of the attack hit at 1400, harder than the first, enough gunfire that the cave walls seemed to vibrate with it. Marlowe worked through it the way she'd worked through everything else, hands moving on instinct while her mind stayed locked on the only math that mattered. Who's stable, who's not, who needs her next? When it finally quieted, she counted the wounded again, still alive, still 52 if you counted the men holding the perimeter along with the ones in the cave, still holding by a thread that felt thinner with every passing hour. Voss found her afterward, slumping down beside her with the particular exhaustion of a man who'd been making impossible decisions for 18 straight hours. Comms are still dead, he said. No word from base, no word from anyone. Which means Price is still running interference. Which means we're on our own until we're not. He rubbed a hand down his face. I keep thinking about Kessler, wondering if there's any way to reach him if things get worse before they get better. Do you know how to find him? I know a frequency, an old one, from back when your father was still alive. Voss looked at her sideways. I never used it. Never had a reason to believe it would still work. Maybe it's time to find out. Voss studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his tired eyes. If I make that call, he said, I'm trusting a man I haven't spoken to in 10 years. A man some people think went rogue. A man who might be the only person left alive who actually knows what happened to your father. Then make the call, Marlowe said, because right now 30 men are counting on options we don't have, and I'd rather take a chance on the truth than keep dying slowly in the dark waiting for someone else to save us. Voss held her gaze, something settling in his expression that looked almost like the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than conscious thought, the moment simply catching up to it. Then nodded once and reached for the old radio equipment tucked in the corner of the cave dust and disuse thick on its casing. If this doesn't work,
he said. We're exactly where we started. And if it does, then maybe your father's silence finally starts talking back. The radio crackled for nearly 10 minutes before anything answered. Static. Then more static. Then, faint and distorted, a voice that sounded like it belonged to a man who hadn't used this particular frequency in a very long time. Who's asking for this channel? Voss's hand tightened on the receiver. Grady Voss, he said. Task Unit Ashwood. We're pinned in the mountains taking heavy fire. No extraction. I need to know if you're still who I think you are. A long pause. Long enough that Marlowe found herself holding her breath, watching Voss's face for any sign of what was coming. Depends, the voice finally said, roughened by time and distance. Who's with you? Voss glanced at Marlowe. Elias Sutton's daughter, he said. She needs answers. You might be the only one left alive to give her. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Marlowe's heart climbed into her throat. Coordinates, the voice said at last, quieter now, almost unsteady. Send me your coordinates. I'm not far, and God help me, I've been waiting 10 years for someone to finally say that name out loud again. Voss read off their position, hands steady, despite the tremor. Marlowe could see building underneath his composure. When he set the receiver down, he looked at her with something between relief and dread. Help might be coming, he said, but so is a conversation you've been owed for 10 years. Marlowe's hand found the shape of her father's journal through her jacket, pressed it flat against her ribs like she could steady her own heartbeat through sheer contact. Then I guess it's finally time, she said, to hear it. Outside the cave, the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant grinding sound of engines climbing the mountain road. Whether that sound belonged to rescue or to the next wave of the fight, none of them yet knew. But for the first time since the helicopter went down, Marlowe let herself believe that the silence her father left behind might finally, after 10 long years, be about to break. She spent the remaining hour before dawn moving quietly among the wounded one final time, checking bandages that didn't need checking, taking pulses that hadn't changed, because the alternative was sitting still with her own thoughts, and stillness tonight felt more dangerous than the mountain itself. Castillo had drifted into an uneasy sleep. Reyes watched her without speaking, some silent understanding passing between them that didn't require words. Doyle kept first watch at the cave mouth, rifle's steady eyes fixed on the dark road below where headlights would eventually appear one way or another. Marlowe sat beside him for a while, saying nothing, the two of them simply watching the same darkness for the same reason, waiting to find out which kind of morning was about to arrive. Somewhere in that long, suspended hour, Harris settled down on her other side, favoring the leg he'd wrenched during the crash, his rifle laid carefully across his knees. You should try to sleep, he said. Even 20 minutes. I could say the same to you. I already tried, didn't take. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion carved deep into every line of it. Every time I close my eyes, I see the ridge lighting up again. Figured I'd rather be tired and useful than tired and staring at the inside of my own eyelids. Marlowe understood that more than she wanted to admit. How's the leg? Manageable. A faint, wry smile. You'd know better than me. You're the one who splinted it. I meant, how does it feel, not whether it'll hold. Harris considered that for a moment, the kind of consideration that meant he wasn't used to being asked. Feels like it belongs to somebody else's body right now, which is probably the adrenaline talking. Ask me again in a week and I'll tell you the truth. I'll hold you to that. He glanced at her sideways, something thoughtful in his expression. Can I ask you something, Doc? And you can tell me it's none of my business. Go ahead. That thing you did back at the crash site, splinting Castillo's leg under fire like it was nothing, the way you moved through the wreckage like you already knew where everyone would be before you even looked. He shook his head slightly. I've served with corpsmen for 12 years. I've never seen anybody move like that. Not once. Marlowe was quiet for a moment, watching the dark road below, where eventually one kind of vehicle or another would arrive. My father used to run drills with me, she finally said. Real drills,
timed, graded. He'd hide injuries on purpose, bruise makeup, fake blood sometimes, just verbal scenarios while we hiked, testing whether I could talk through a treatment plan on the move.
I thought for years that every kid with a parent in the service grew up like that. Took me a long time to realize it wasn't normal, that it was something he built specifically for a reason he never explained. You think he knew that something like tonight might come? I don't know what he knew, Marlowe admitted. I just know he made sure I'd be ready for it, whatever it turned out to be. Whether that was foresight or just love with sharp edges, I still haven't figured out. Harris nodded slowly, some old grief of his own moving behind his eyes, private and unspoken. My old man taught me how to change a carburetor, he said after a moment, a small, tired attempt at levity. Guess we all get handed something different. Guess we do, Marlowe said, and for just a moment in the cold hour before dawn, the weight in her chest eased by some small, immeasurable degree. She thought not for the first time that night about how strange it was that grief and gratitude could occupy the exact same space in a person's chest without ever canceling each other out. She was furious still, at the 10 years of silence, at the folder Voss had kept sealed in some drawer out of fear and guilt, at a system that had decided her father's death was easier to bury than explain. And she was grateful, in the same breath, for every hour in the Maine woods that had somehow impossibly prepared her for this exact mountain, this exact cave, these exact men whose lives now depended on hands her father had spent a childhood shaping. Both things were true. She didn't try to resolve them, she simply carried them the way she carried everything else that mattered, close enough to reach and steady enough not to break her. Doyle shifted beside her, breaking the long silence. "Vehicle," he said quietly, nodding toward the faint distant glow of headlights, finally cresting the lowest switchback of the mountain road. Still miles off, but unmistakably real. Multiple, by the sound of it. Marlowe felt her pulse pick up some old familiar readiness settling over her, the same readiness her father had spent a childhood building into her, one quiet weekend at a time. "Then I guess we're about to find out," she said, "which kind of morning this is." She thought in that last quiet stretch before the vehicles finally arrived close enough to matter about something else her father used to say, not written in the journal, just spoken once on a night much like this one, though she'd been too young then to fully understand it. Whatever's coming down that road, he'd told her, doesn't get to decide who you are before it arrives. You decide that first, then you let it try. She hadn't understood it at 13. She understood it now, sitting in a cave with the weight of 52 lives balanced somewhere behind her ribs, watching a pair of headlights climb toward a mountain that hadn't yet decided whether it planned to give any of them back to the world they'd left behind 6 days ago. Back when none of this had a shape yet. Back when it was still just an unopened folder and a name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 10 years. Dawn broke gray and reluctant over the ridgeline, and the sound Marlowe had heard building through the night finally revealed itself. Not one engine, several. Grinding up the switchback road below, kicking dust into the pale early light, and for one suspended moment nobody in that cave knew whether they were listening to rescue or to the next wave of their own ending. "Voss!" Her voice cut through the cave, low and urgent. "Vehicles! Multiple!" He was at her side in seconds, field glasses already rising to his eyes. "3 technicals," he said. "Can't tell markings from this angle. Friendly or hostile? I don't know yet." The not knowing sat heavier than either answer would have. Harris limped over, favoring the leg he'd twisted during the crash, face grim in the gray light. "Com's still dead," he reported. "Whatever Price is doing back at base, it's still working." The name landed like a struck match, same as it had every time someone said it aloud since the truth first surfaced. Because Marlowe had spent the last several hours turning that betrayal over and over in her mind, trying to find some version of events that didn't end with someone in their own chain of command selling them out. She hadn't found one. And underneath that certainty sat an older, colder one. The one that had been quietly reshaping itself since Voss first said the word ambush 10 years too late. Her father's death.
A training accident, the Navy said, except training accidents didn't usually involve compromised operations and buried case files. Except her father's team had walked into an ambush that should never have happened, according to the man now bleeding beside her, which meant the pattern was the same, which meant this wasn't coincidence. It was continuation.
Sutton, Voss's voice snapped her back. Where'd you go just now? Nowhere I can afford to stay, she said, and shouldered her kit, forcing her focus back onto the 30 men who needed her more than her grief did right now.
The vehicles kept climbing. The lead technical crested the final switchback and rolled to a stop 200 meters below the cave mouth, and through the field glasses, Voss finally exhaled something that sounded almost like relief.
Not hostile markings, he said. That's not the compound's paint scheme. You're sure? I'm sure enough to walk out there and find out.
A man climbed down from the lead vehicle. Tall, weathered, moving with the particular authority of someone long used to being obeyed, and longer used to not caring whether he was. His face was creased with sun and age, and something in his bearing struck Marlowe as familiar in a way she couldn't yet place. The way a half-remembered song feels before you catch the melody. Voss went still beside her.
Kessler, he breathed. Then louder, already moving down the slope toward him. Kessler. The man looked up, stopped walking, stared at Voss across the distance for a long moment before something in his weathered face cracked open into recognition. Grady Voss, he called back, voice rough with disuse. Didn't expect to see your face again in this lifetime.
You're supposed to be dead.
So were a lot of people.
Kessler's eyes shifted past Voss up toward the cave mouth, toward the small figure standing there with a rifle slung across her shoulder and a father's journal pressed against her ribs. He stopped breathing. My God, he said. Marlowe made her way down the slope slowly, every instinct she owned screaming caution, even as something older and quieter told her this man wasn't the danger. Up close, Kessler looked older than the radio voice had suggested. 60, maybe close to it. Deep lines carved into sun-worn skin, a scar cutting through one eyebrow, eyes that carried the particular exhaustion of a man who'd spent a decade running from something he never stopped chasing. You look just like him, Kessler said quietly before she'd even reached level ground. Just like Elias. The name hit her like a physical blow. You knew my father. I served with your father. Kessler's voice roughened. 6 years. Before everything fell apart. Fell apart how? Kessler glanced at Voss, some silent, complicated communication passing between two men who clearly shared history neither of them wanted to revisit standing in the open. That's a longer story than we have time for on this ridge, Kessler said. But I promise you this. I didn't come here to hurt anyone. I intercepted intelligence about this operation 3 days ago. Once I saw the coordinates, once I saw what compound was involved, I didn't hesitate. You knew, Marlowe said slowly, you knew this was connected to whatever happened to my father. I've spent 10 years trying to prove it, Kessler said. 10 years the Navy spent trying to bury it instead. Something in Marlowe's chest, some tight and aching thing she'd been carrying since the funeral, loosened by the smallest degree. Not relief, not yet, but the first thin edge of something that might eventually become it. She studied him a moment longer, this stranger who somehow wasn't a stranger at all, who'd apparently spent a decade of his life chasing the same ghost she had, in a different uniform, on a different continent, alone, in a way she'd never fully appreciated until this exact moment. Why didn't you ever come find me? She asked. In 10 years, if you knew this much, why didn't you ever come find me? She asked. In 10 years, if you knew this much, if you cared this much. Kessler's expression cracked just slightly, the weathered composure slipping to show something raw underneath. Because every time I got close to surfacing, somebody connected to this network came looking for me first, he said. I told myself staying gone was protecting you, protecting your mother. I've had a decade to wonder if that was actually true, or if it was just the easiest excuse for a coward to hide behind. He held her gaze steady, despite the admission. I don't have a good answer for you, Marlowe. Just an honest one. I was afraid, and I let that fear cost you 10 years you'll never get back. Marlowe didn't have a response for that, not yet. The honesty landing somewhere she wasn't prepared to examine in the middle of a mountainside with 52 lives still hanging in the balance. We'll finish this conversation later, in full, once there's actually time enough to sit with it, she said instead, meaning every word of it. Right now, I need you inside that cave telling my commanding officer everything you know. Something like respect moved across Kessler's weathered face. Yes, ma'am, he said, and for the first time since he'd climbed down from that truck, he almost smiled. Voss joined them as Kessler's men fanned out to secure the perimeter, his expression, a strange mixture of relief and old grief resurfacing all at once. 10 years, Voss said, shaking his head slowly, studying Kessler like a man confirming a ghost was actually solid enough to touch. 10 years, and you just show up on a mountain road like no time passed at all. Time passed, Kessler said quietly. Believe me, it just didn't heal the way people promise it will. Where have you been all this time? Moving. Kessler's expression turned distant. Central America for a while, then Europe, wherever I could work the case without drawing attention. I had a few contacts inside the intelligence community who fed me pieces when they could quietly, off the books. It was slow, slower than I wanted. But every piece I gathered was another piece Elias's daughter might need someday if she ever came looking. He glanced toward Marlowe, who was several yards away now, checking on the wounded being loaded for transport. I didn't expect someday to arrive quite like this. None of us did. She's remarkable, Voss. You understand that, don't you? Whatever guilt you're carrying about how she ended up here? Kessler paused, weighing his next words carefully. She didn't survive that mountain because of luck, or because you put her in the right place at the right time. She survived it because Elias spent years making sure she would, long before either of us understood why it might matter this much. Voss absorbed that in silence, watching Marlowe work something like quiet awe moving behind his tired eyes. I know, he said finally. I've known since the first night at Ashwood when Harris told me she moved like someone who'd done this before. I just didn't understand yet how much before meant. Now you do. Now I do, Voss agreed, and the two men stood together for a moment in silence, two old friends reunited by tragedy watching the daughter of the man they'd both failed to save finish the job none of them had managed alone. They regrouped inside the cave system while Kessler's men secured the perimeter and confirmed what the technical's arrival had already suggested. The immediate threat had scattered, at least for now, driven off by numbers Kessler had brought that the compound hadn't expected to face. Marlowe sat across from Kessler in the dim light, her father's journal resting on her knee, Voss standing tense beside her, like a man bracing for impact he'd been bracing for since 1600 hours a decade ago. Tell me everything, she said. From the beginning. Kessler exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that seemed to carry actual weight. Your father and I were part of a joint task force, he began, a decade ago. Working an operation that uncovered something nobody wanted uncovered, a private contracting network selling classified intelligence to the highest bidder. Foreign governments, criminal organizations, anyone with enough money and no interest in asking where the information came from. And someone found out you knew. Someone found out Elias knew. Kessler's voice roughened. He was closer to proving it than any of us. Building a case. Names, dates, financial records, everything we needed to bring the whole network down. So they killed him. They made it look like an accident. Kessler met her eyes, steady now, like a man finally setting down a weight he'd carried alone for too long. And when I tried to keep investigating after his death, they came after me too. I disappeared because it was the only way to keep working the case without ending up the same way he did. Marlowe's hands tightened around the journal. 10 years, she said. 10 years, and nobody told me any of this. Because nobody knew who to trust, Voss said quietly. Because the network reached into places we couldn't see. Still reaches, apparently, if Price sold us out yesterday. Kessler's expression darkened. Price. Our liaison officer fed our coordinates to whoever's running this compound. That tracks, Kessler said grimly. The network's still operating, still selling. This compound, he gestured toward the buildings visible in the distance, is one of their primary storage sites. Documents, financial records, everything that could expose the entire operation if it ever saw daylight. Marlowe felt something shift inside her chest. A decade of grief finally finding a direction to point itself in. Then that's where we're going, she said. Sutton, Voss started, that's where the truth is. She stood, jaw set, every ounce of her father's stubbornness rising to the surface like it had been waiting years for exactly this moment. That's where I finish what he started. Kessler studied her for a long moment, something like recognition moving across his weathered face. He used to say something like that, he said quietly, almost word for word. I'm starting to hear that a lot, Marlowe said. Get used to it, Kessler said. It doesn't stop being true just because it's familiar. Voss looked between the two of them, something complicated moving across his own tired face. Part grief, part reluctant admiration, part a decade of guilt finally beginning to loosen its grip. If we're doing this, he said finally, we do it together, all of us. Nobody goes anywhere alone. Wouldn't have it any other way, Kessler said. Marlowe looked at the two men. One who'd spent a decade drowning in guilt, one who'd spent a decade running from fear. Both of them finally standing in the same room because a 25-year-old corpsman had refused to let her father's silence stay buried any longer. Then let's go finish it, she said. Before they moved out, Marlowe took a final moment near the cave mouth, checking her kit one last time, the same ritual she'd performed on the tarmac 6 days ago in a different life, before any of them had understood what this mission would actually demand of them. Castillo, too wounded to join the assault, watched her from his spot against the rock wall, his legs splinted and stable, waiting now only for the rescue that Kessler's arrival had finally made possible. Go finish what you came for, Doc, he said quietly. We'll be fine here. I know you will. You sound sure. I am sure. She knelt beside him briefly, checking his pulse one final time out of habit more than necessity. You made it through the worst of it. The rest is just waiting now. You're good at waiting. You've been doing it all night. Castillo managed a tired, genuine smile. Guess I have been. When we get back, Marlowe added, standing, you're going to tell me more about that grandmother of yours. The one you call every Sunday? You'd like her, Castillo said. She'd probably try to feed you the second she met you. I'd probably let her. She left him with that small promise hanging between them, another thread in the growing net of connections this mountain had somehow woven, despite everything trying to tear it apart, and turned to join Voss and Kessler at the cave mouth, ready to finish what 6 days and 10 years had been building toward all along. The assault on the compound began at noon, coordinated between Voss's remaining team and Kessler's small but well-equipped unit, the combined force moving with the particular efficiency of people who'd all, in their own ways, been waiting years for this exact fight. Marlowe moved with them this time, not as a corpsman held back for safety, as someone who'd earned her place in that line by every measure that mattered, and who intended to be standing when the truth finally arrived. The compound's defenses crumbled faster than expected, the enemy force thinned by their failed assault on the cave that morning, their attention split between two fronts they hadn't planned to defend simultaneously. Within 20 minutes, the combined team breached the main building, clearing rooms with practiced efficiency, moving toward the server room Kessler insisted held the evidence they needed. Twice during that breach, Marlowe found herself the only one positioned to make a call under fire, her father's old lessons surfacing exactly when they were needed. The stillness before the fast part when stillness ran out. Once pulling Prentice back from a doorway half a second before a burst of gunfire tore through the space he'd been standing in. Once calling a halt to the advance when her eyes caught a wire strung low across a hallway that everyone else had missed. In the dim light, a tripwire connected to something none of them wanted to discover the hard way.
How'd you catch that?
Harris asked afterward, breathing hard, staring at the wire like it might still bite him. My father used to hide trip lines in the woods, Marlowe said. Just fishing line and bells, mostly. Made me walk the same trail 100 times until I stopped missing them. She stepped carefully over the wire, gesturing the rest of the team through behind her.
Turns out the lesson generalizes. Kessler, moving up behind them, paused beside the wire long enough to examine the mechanism. It was rigged to a small, ugly device tucked into the wall behind a loose panel. That would have taken out half this hallway, he said grimly. Your father used to have an eye for these too. Used to say most people look at a room and see furniture. He said you had to learn to see the room the way someone building a trap would see it. He glanced at Marlowe with something like wonder. Apparently, that particular lesson made it all the way down to you too. Apparently, Marlowe said, and kept moving because there wasn't time to sit with the strange, aching pride of being compared to a man she'd spent 10 years missing. They cleared the next 3 rooms without incident. The enemy's remaining defenders either fled or fallen back towards some final position deeper in the compound. Marlowe found herself falling into an easy rhythm alongside Kessler's men, calling out clear rooms, flagging hazards, her voice steady in a way that made even the newest of Kessler's operators glance at her twice. You sure she's just a corpsman? One of them muttered to Harris, loud enough for Marlowe to hear. Ask her yourself, Harris said, not unkindly. Just don't expect a simple answer. They found the man in charge waiting for them in the final room. Older, gray-haired, wearing civilian clothes that did nothing to hide the military bearing underneath the kind of posture that didn't retire even when the uniform did. Kessler, the man said, almost pleasant-like. They were old colleagues meeting for coffee instead of enemies meeting at gunpoint. I wondered when you'd finally track us down. Marcus! Kessler's weapon didn't waver. It's over. Is it? The man's eyes shifted to Marlowe, studying her with unsettling recognition. You brought Elias's daughter. That's either very brave or very foolish. You knew my father, Marlowe said, voice steady despite the fury building underneath it. I served with him, before I understood what this government actually values. Something bitter twisted across his face. You want to know the part nobody writes into the official reports, Miss Sutton? Tell me. I begged them not to bury his investigation. Marcus's voice cracked unexpectedly, the civility slipping just enough to show something raw underneath. I sat in a room with 3 admirals and told them we owed your father better than silence. They told me my career would end that same afternoon if I said it again, so I learned the actual lesson this Navy teaches its own people. Loyalty only runs in one direction. I simply stopped being the only one who paid the price for believing otherwise. So you gave the order that killed him. Something cold settled over Marcus's face. I made a decision to survive a system that had already decided your father was expendable the moment his investigation became inconvenient. I didn't invent that cruelty, Miss Sutton. I only learned to use it before it used me. That's not an excuse. I never said it was. Something almost like exhaustion moved across his face, 10 years of justification finally meeting the one person who'd never accepted. It's just the truth, which is apparently what you came all this way to hear. Marlowe's grip tightened on her weapon, because part of her wanted to end this, right here. Wanted 10 years of grief to finally have somewhere violent to go. Except that wasn't what her father would have wanted. Except violence for its own sake wasn't justice. It was just more blood added to blood already spilled. And she hadn't survived a helicopter crash and 30 hours in a cave to become the next name on that ledger. You're going to give us those files, she said instead. And you're going to answer for what you did. In a courtroom, not out here. Marcus laughed, short and humorless. You think there's a courtroom that wants this truth exposed? You think the same people who buried your father's case for 10 years suddenly want it reopened? I don't care what they want, Marlowe said. I care what's true. Something in Marcus's expression flickered, not quite respect, but close enough to matter. Your father said almost the exact same thing, he said quietly, right before I gave the order that killed him. The room went silent, because that was the confession they'd traveled 10 years and 3,000 miles to hear, and it landed exactly as heavy as 10 years of waiting had promised it would. Marlowe felt something break open inside her chest. Grief and rage and something close to relief, all tangled together into a shape too large to name. Then you're going to say it again, she said, on the record, to every investigator who's ever wanted to bury this. Marcus studied her for a long, considering moment, the fight visibly draining out of him now that the one thing he'd never said aloud had finally left his mouth. Then slowly he lowered the weapon he'd been holding. Your father would be proud of you, he said quietly. Whatever that's worth coming from me. It's not worth anything, Marlowe said, coming from you. But I'll take the files anyway. Marcus watched as Kessler's men moved past him toward the server racks, some of the old bitterness in his expression giving way slowly to something closer to resignation. You know what the worst part is? He said, almost conversational now, like the fight had simply drained out of him, along with the last of his authority. I used to think about your father sometimes, wondered what he'd have made of the man I became. He was the kind of person who believed the system could be fixed from the inside if enough people had the courage to stay and fight for it. I believed that too once. And now? Now I think the system doesn't get fixed, it just gets outlasted, one honest person at a time, until eventually somebody like you shows up and refuses to let it win by attrition. Something almost like a bitter smile crossed his face. I suppose that's what I'm looking at right now. Attrition, finally losing. You could have been that person, Marlowe said, the one who stayed and fought instead of the one who broke. I could have. Marcus's voice went flat. I wasn't. That's mine to carry, not yours to forgive. I'm not offering forgiveness. I know, Marcus said quietly. I wouldn't have accepted it if you were. Kessler approached from the server room doorway, a hard drive in hand, his expression grim with confirmation. It's all here. Financial records tracing back 6 years, names of every buyer, every contact inside the department who helped bury the original investigation. He looked at Marcus. Including yours, twice over. I assumed as much, Marcus said, and for the first time since they'd entered the room, something like relief moved across his weathered face, the particular relief of a man finally released from the exhausting work of hiding. Two of Kessler's men moved to restrain him, and Marcus offered no resistance, standing quietly while they secured his hands, his eyes finding Marlowe's one last time before they led him away. For what it's worth, he said, I hope the truth costs you less than it cost him. Marlowe watched him go, escorted out through the same hallway where she'd caught the tripwire an hour earlier, and found herself thinking unexpectedly of something her father had written near the back of the journal, a passage she'd read a dozen times without ever fully understanding until this exact moment. Every enemy you'll ever face was someone's son first. One-line read. That doesn't make what they did forgivable, it just means the story is always longer than the ending you're standing in. She hadn't understood that as a teenager, reading it in the quiet of her bedroom, grief still too raw to make room for nuance. She understood it now, watching Marcus disappear around a corner in handcuffs, a man who'd once believed in the same things her father believed in before fear had carved a different path through him. It didn't excuse anything. Her father's note had been right about that much, but it explained something she hadn't expected to need explaining, why Kessler had spent 10 years chasing this case instead of simply hating the people responsible for it. Hatred was easy. It burned hot and fast and left you with nothing afterward except ash and a permanent chip on your shoulder. Understanding took longer, cost more, and gave you something to build with when the fire finally went out. She wasn't ready to forgive Marcus. She wasn't sure she ever would be. But she found standing in that hallway with the weight of the confession still settling into her bones that she no longer needed to hate him in order to move forward. The truth was enough. It had always been enough. That was the whole point of 10 years of searching for it. The server room yielded everything Kessler promised and more. A decade of financial records, encrypted communications, names of buyers and sellers, stretching across 3 continents, and buried at the center of it, a single case file, marked with her father's name and a classification stamp that had kept the truth sealed for 10 years. Marlowe held that file for a long moment before opening it, some part of her aware that once she read it, there would be no going back to not knowing. She opened it anyway, because that had always been the promise. Since the funeral, since the flag folded into a triangle in her mother's lap, since a 12-year-old girl learned to find a pulse point through a winter coat without ever asking why it mattered so much to the man teaching her. The file confirmed everything Kessler and Marcus had said in the cold, clinical language of official records. Operation compromised, coordinates leaked, ambush confirmed as deliberate, not incidental. Investigation terminated by order of senior command, citing national security concerns that, reading between the sanitized lines, meant nothing more than the truth being inconvenient to people with more power than conscience. There was one page near the back she hadn't expected. A handwritten note, her father's handwriting unmistakable even after all these years, tucked into the file like it had been waiting there specifically for her to find. Just a few lines, dated 3 days before his death, addressed to no one in particular. The kind of note a man writes when he suspects he might not get the chance to say it out loud. If anyone ever reads this who isn't supposed to, I did what was right, even when it cost me everything. Tell my daughter survival was never about strength. Tell her it was always about who refuses to stop breathing. I hope she never needs to know why I kept saying that. I hope, if she ever does, that she remembers I meant every word. Marlowe read it twice, her hands steady, even as something in her chest finally fully broke open. 10 years of grief and searching, arriving all at once at the one place they'd always been heading. 10 years of not knowing resolved in a single page she hadn't known to look for. She closed the file slowly, pressed it against her chest, the same way she'd carried the journal for a decade, and allowed herself, finally, one single breath that wasn't braced for the next crisis. "We have what we need," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "Let's go home." The extraction happened 3 hours later, a Navy rescue team finally cutting through the mountains after Kessler's satellite phone reestablished contact with an agency outside the compromised chain of command, an agency that listened for the first time in 10 years to what someone was trying to tell them. Marlowe stood near the wreckage of the original helicopter, watching the new aircraft descend 30 exhausted, wounded but breathing men gathered around her. All 52. Every single one, when you counted the perimeter team alongside the wounded, when you counted every promise made on a dark tarmac 6 days ago, and somehow against every reasonable expectation kept. Voss found her there, exhaustion carved into every line of his face, relief finally allowed to surface now that the immediate danger had passed, and the older danger had finally been named out loud. "We did it," he said quietly. "We did it," she agreed. "Your father's case, it's going to be reopened, officially. With Marcus's confession on record and Kessler's evidence behind it, there's no way they can bury it again." Marlowe looked out at the valley, the same valley that had nearly swallowed all 52 of them whole, now quiet in the afternoon light. Smoke from the compound still rising thin against a sky finally clearing. 10 years, she said softly. 10 years of not knowing. I'm sorry it took this long. You brought me here. She turned to face him fully, the words carrying more weight now than they would have 6 days ago, back when she'd barely known this man beyond a name spoken once at a funeral. You gave me the chance to find the truth. That's more than the Navy gave me in 10 years of asking politely and getting nothing back. Voss's throat worked. I owed your father that much. I owed you that much. Kessler approached as the rescue helicopter's rotors began winding down, watching the reunion with something unreadable in his weathered face. What happens to you now? Marlowe asked him. After this. I go back to being a ghost, probably. A faint, tired smile. It's what I'm good at. But I'll testify. Whatever they need, whenever they need it. Your father deserves that much, even 10 years late.
Thank you. Don't thank me. Kessler's expression softened just slightly. You did the hard part. I just showed up with trucks. You showed up, Marlowe said. After 10 years of not knowing if you would. That's not nothing, Kessler. Not to me. Something moved behind his weathered eyes, some old weight shifting just slightly, the first small evidence of a decade of guilt beginning, however slowly, to loosen its grip. Marlowe reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out the worn leather journal, held it against her chest one final time before slipping it carefully back into place. He always said readiness was a myth, she said quietly. Said you just decide the mission matters more than the fear. And then you go anyway, Voss finished. And then you go anyway, she confirmed. The rescue helicopter touched down, rotors kicking up dust and debris, and around them 52 men began the slow, exhausted process of finally going home. Reyes found her as they boarded, exhaustion and something like wonder still fresh on his face. You promised me a conversation, he said, if we made it out. I remember. We made it out. Marlowe allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first real one in what felt like days. Ask me again once we're actually home, she said. I'll hold up my end, I always do. Reyes nodded, satisfied with that, and the aircraft lifted off the mountainside, carrying 52 men and one folded case file back toward a world that had until 3 days ago decided the truth wasn't worth the trouble of finding. Lieutenant Commander Price was arrested at Naval Station Norfolk 2 days after Marlowe's team returned stateside, quietly escorted from his office by 2 agents from Naval Criminal Investigative Service, while the rest of the base carried on unaware around him. Marlowe heard about it secondhand from Voss over a phone call she almost didn't answer. They found transfers, Voss told her. Wire records going back 18 months. He wasn't just feeding coordinates to Marcus's network, he was being paid for it. Regularly. A pause, heavy with something like disgust. I served with that man for 3 years, Sutton. Trusted him with operational security more times than I can count. You couldn't have known. That's what everyone keeps telling me, Voss said. About Price, about your father. Seems like there's an awful lot of things none of us could have known, and somehow all of them ended up costing somebody their life. Maybe the lesson isn't that we should have known, Marlowe said quietly. Maybe it's that we finally do, now. That has to count for something. It does, Voss agreed. I just wish it hadn't taken this long or cost this much to get here. She didn't have an answer for that either, not one that would have made either of them feel any better. She simply let the silence sit between them for a moment, the particular kind of silence that had become familiar over the past several weeks. Heavy, but no longer suffocating. The difference between a wound still bleeding and one finally beginning slowly to close. 3 weeks later, Marlowe stood at a cemetery outside Norfolk, sunlight breaking soft and warm through a canopy of oak trees, a folded flag pressed against her chest for the second time in her life. This time, though, it wasn't grief alone carrying her forward. It was closure. Finally arrived after 10 years of waiting for a door that everyone told her would never open. The investigation had moved fast once Marcus's confession hit official channels, once Kessler's decade of buried evidence finally saw daylight, once enough people with enough courage decided the truth mattered more than the comfortable silence that had protected it for so long. Master Chief Elias Sutton's name had been formally cleared of any wrongdoing, his death officially reclassified. Not an accident. A sacrifice made in service of exposing corruption that had cost lives far beyond his own. The record finally matching the man Marlowe had always known him to be. Her mother stood beside the headstone when Marlowe arrived, a hand pressed lightly to her own chest, the same gesture Marlowe had unconsciously inherited without ever realizing where it came from. They read me his note, her mother said quietly without turning. The one from the file, about refusing to stop breathing. Her voice caught and steadied. 10 years, and he still found a way to have the last word. I read it too, Marlowe said, more than once. I know. Her mother finally turned to look at her, eyes bright with a decade of unshed grief finally allowed to surface.
You have his handwriting, you know. Did anyone ever tell you that? Not the letters themselves, the way you hold a pen, same grip, same angle. I noticed it when you were small and never had the heart to mention it.
Marlowe hadn't known that. She filed it away carefully, another small piece of him she hadn't realized she still carried.
I read the whole file, you know, her mother said after a moment. Every page. Commander Voss brought me a copy before he even showed you, said I deserved to see it first, given everything. Her hands twisted together, restless, the way they always did when she was working up to something difficult. There's a section in there about the calls he used to take on the porch.
Turns out he was talking to Kessler some of those nights, building the case together, piece by piece, without either of us ever knowing how close it would come to costing him. Did knowing that make it easier or harder?
Her mother considered the question with the same careful honesty Marlowe recognized in herself.
Both,
she finally said.
Harder because I spent 10 years thinking I'd simply failed to notice something was wrong. Easier because now I know I wasn't failing to notice. He was protecting me from something he knew was dangerous. That's a different kind of grief to carry. Lighter, somehow, even though the loss weighs exactly the same.
Marlowe thought about Voss saying something similar weeks ago, in a cave 3,000 miles from here.
About the difference between silence as failure and silence as an unfinished kind of love. I used to be so angry at him, Marlowe admitted quietly. For years, actually. Not for dying. For not telling me why he trained me so hard. Why he never let me just be a normal kid, even for a weekend. Are you still angry?
Marlowe considered the headstone, the flag, the small crowd of survivors standing respectfully a short distance away, alive because of exactly the training she'd once resented.
No, she said. I think I finally understand what it cost him to give me something he couldn't explain yet. I think that's its own kind of love. The kind that doesn't wait for gratitude because it knows gratitude might take 10 years to arrive.
Her mother reached out, took her hand, held it the way she used to when Marlowe was small enough to need holding.
He'd be so proud, she said. Not just of what you did out there, of who you became. Figuring out how to carry it. I know, Marlowe said, and meant it, fully, for the first time since the folded flag had first landed in her mother's lap 10 years ago.
Voss stood a respectful distance away along with Harris, Reyes Castillo, and a dozen others from the unit who'd insisted on being there, who'd told her each in their own quiet way that they owed her their lives and intended to spend the rest of those lives showing up whenever she needed them. Kessler stood a little apart from the group, hands folded, the particular stillness of a man paying respects to someone he'd failed to save but never stopped trying to vindicate.
Voss approached the headstone once the others had paid their respects, his own composure fraying slightly at the edges.
He'd be proud of you, Voss said, again, the same words he'd offered a dozen times since the mountain, except this time they finally felt like they belonged to the present instead of some desperate promise made in the dark. I know, Marlowe said, and for the first time in 10 years she believed it completely, without the small, aching doubt that used to live underneath every version of that sentence. She knelt at the headstone, placed a single medal beside the flag already resting there, one she'd been awarded for actions during the operation but had never quite felt was hers alone to keep. This belongs to both of us, she said quietly. Everything I did out there, it was you working through me. It was always going to be you.
The wind moved gently through the oak trees above, and for just a moment, standing there with the truth finally settled and the weight of 10 years finally lifted, Marlowe Sutton allowed herself to simply breathe. Not as a corpsman, not as a soldier, just as a daughter, finally, impossibly, at peace. She rose slowly, looked around at the small crowd of people who'd once doubted her, who now stood in quiet, unshakable loyalty beside her.
Thank you, she said, for trusting me when it mattered. Thank you, Harris replied, for making sure we lived long enough to say it.
Castillo, leaning on a cane he'd need for another few months yet, added quietly, "And for the fishing story. Kept me talking through the worst of it." "Anytime," Marlowe said, "though I'd rather tell it to you somewhere that isn't a cave next time."
"Deal," Castillo said, echoing the exact word she'd used with Reyes on that mountainside, and something in the small circle of survivors around her softened at the small, unplanned rhyme of it. A promise made and kept, and now somehow being made again. Marlowe allowed herself a small, tired smile. Because that was the whole story, really. Not the gunfire, or the betrayal, or the decade of buried grief. Just this. A promise made and kept. 52 men who went home because someone refused to stop breathing on their behalf the same way her father had once refused to stop breathing on behalf of countless others before her. A lesson passed down not in words but in reflexes, in hands that moved before fear could catch up to them. Some legacies weren't written in medals or case files. Some legacies were carried forward in the steady hands of the people who inherited them, tested in mountains nobody chose but everybody survived because somebody once, long ago, cared enough to make sure they would. As Marlowe Sutton walked away from her father's grave that afternoon, sunlight warm against her shoulders, the small crowd of people who owed her their lives falling into step quietly beside her, she carried his legacy forward into whatever came next. Ready, finally, to keep going. Not because the fear was gone, but because just like he'd taught her, the mission had always mattered more than that, and some truths only reveal their full weight once you've finally set them down. Behind her, the oak trees swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, sunlight scattering through the leaves in the same shifting golden patterns her father had once shown her in a clearing in Maine, patient enough to wait 2 hours for her to finally understand what stillness could teach a person about survival. She understood it fully now. Not as a lesson anymore, as a legacy carried forward one steady breath at a time, exactly the way he'd always intended it to be passed from a father's hands to a daughter's, and now, perhaps someday, to whoever needed steadying next. A chain of readiness stretching backward through generations she'd never met and forward into futures she couldn't yet imagine. Each link forged the same way hers had been, quietly, patiently, in ordinary afternoons that never once announced how much they mattered until the day they finally did, when the world came apart at the seams and something learned long ago simply stepped forward to hold it together.